Every pattern designer can benefit from a streamlined approach to creating instructions, so Wild Ginger Software is introducing Stitch Kitty V7, the first and only automated sewing guide sheet generator. Stitch Kitty creates professional guide sheets to publish with your patterns. It features detailed sewing instructions and over 7,500 high-quality images to create guide sheets. It covers tops, skirts, pants, jackets, swimwear, foundation garments, and more. Rely on Stitch Kitty to add size charts, cutting guides, suggested fabrics, notion lists, and digital pattern printing instructions. Get more information, including a free demo, at wildginger.com/StitchKitty.
Hello and welcome to Sewing with Threads, the monthly podcast with the staff of Threads magazine. I'm Carol Fraser, your host, and I'm joined by my colleague Janine Clegg. Hi, Janine.
Hi, Carol. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Yeah, our guest today is Sarah Veblen, a sewing instructor with decades of experience designing, creating custom clothing, and teaching sewing, both in person and online. She's a fitting expert and author and developer of the Eureka Pants That Fit pattern. From classroom teaching to one-on-one mentoring, and even in her own sewing, Sarah has witnessed or experienced personally the frustration that sewing can bring. We want to get an expert's perspective on where that frustration comes from, how to deal with it, and how to avoid it in the first place. So, hello, Sarah, and we've got you here to tell us about how to not be frustrated when we're sewing.
Well, I think there is in any creative process, there's frustration is going to be inevitable at some point, and I will talk about some of the things that I found are effective for me, as well as some of my students, to avert that, head it off before it really bites you and gets you in a tizzy.
So what are your top sources of frustration, would you say?
So over the years, I've mentored a lot of people and now have a formal mentorship program. And there are 6 areas that I have identified that seem to be recurring areas where people get frustrated. The first one I refer to as sewing technique snafus. So your buttonholer won't work right, or you're using some sort of edge stitching foot and you can't work it right, or you can't manage to get the results you want. So sewing technique snafus, ripping out, so having to go backwards in a project is often a cause of frustration. Pattern work and fitting issues. Of course, this is a rather large topic in and of itself, and a lot of people would separate those two out. I put them together because to me, they do go together. I think our sewing spaces can be sources of frustration too, and I'm happy to talk about that. I think with garment sewing, because of the huge amount of fabric that is available to us and the different patterns that are available to us, the 5th category of frustration I find that people struggle with is having too many choices. There's just, how do you even decide what to get started on? Because the sky's the limit. You can just imagine anything. And then being productive, I think that's another area where people get very frustrated with themselves, that either they want to sew, but they can't get themselves sewing, or they see what somebody else is producing and they're only producing 1/100th of that. And so being productive encompasses a number of different areas where I think people get frustrated.
Oh, Sarah, that's a huge list and very comprehensive. I don't know where to begin, but I do want to ask you about the first one, because I think a lot of us have had that issue before, where there's a piece of equipment that's not working correctly, or you think is not working correctly. Either you're using it incorrectly or something just snagged. I mean, I remember one of our associate editors, she had a sewing machine that her mother had given her, and she was using that for the longest time. And she used to get so frustrated because it was not working correctly. It was one of those big box on sale machines that was picked up quickly, and it was not a very good quality machine, and she just fought with it all the time. And I think she finally realized, oh, maybe it's time to just get a new machine. But do we have to get a new piece of equipment every time the one that we have doesn't work correctly? I guess that's my question.
Sometimes we do. I was visiting a friend once many years ago, and I was sewing prolifically, and she was working. I was not working at the time, and I said, "Oh, I'll make you a dress while I'm here." And I used her sewing machine, and I literally thought, "I don't know how to sew anymore," and because the machine just wasn't a good machine. In that case, it needed to be replaced. It was, in fact, the machine. But there are times that we don't know how to use the piece of equipment effectively, or how the manufacturer intended us to use it. And learning how your machine does buttonholes, for example, is really important. And every machine seems to do them kind of the same, but it's kind of different too. And so there is an element of practice. I talk in my work a lot about the importance of making samples, test samples. And somebody said, well, when you do buttonholes, what do you do? Well, I make exactly the sandwich of fabric and interfacings I have. And I typically am going to make 5 to 15 buttonholes, testing the length and the width of the stitch. And for that particular fabric, the interfacing, I might change that type of thing. Samples are really important to prevent frustration, because sample you can throw away. It's a little piece of fabric most of the time. Whereas if you're trying to jump right in and put buttonholes on a garment and they mess up, then you might have fouled up your whole garment. So sometimes I do think it's the equipment, and sometimes I think it's that we just don't know how to use the equipment properly. And there are a lot of resources. Of course, the internet is a wonderful resource. The internet also, in my opinion, has a lot of not so helpful information. And what worked for one person, they might say, oh, this is the best thing ever. Do it this way. Your problems will be solved. Well, you have to remember, it worked for them, and what their machine is, how their fingers just manipulate things, how their brain processes information. So I think it's important when you are using the internet to get tips about how to do something, is to sample a lot of different opinions. And often what I end up doing, and what some of my students say they do, is they kind of take a piece from this and a piece from this and a piece from this. They kind of come up with their own method of doing it.
That makes a lot of sense. The idea that there are many factors in anything that you're doing. And, one is the machinery, one is your ability to use it. Another thing is any type of material you're doing or your specific project. And if you are not feeling confident, you may not be able to even diagnose which thing is going wrong, or
right,
which things are going wrong. And that's where the samples come in, where you can try the different variables. And, maybe will help people stop immediately determining that it's their own fault and that it's just a lot of things, and you can solve those things, and you don't have to be thinking, I'm just like you said, I think I don't know how to sew anymore.
Right.
You can
One thing that I do with samples, if I'm having trouble getting something, is I'll go back and use like a basic cotton. So I might be having trouble getting good, again, I'll use buttonholes, but a nice buttonhole on a silk charmeuse blouse. And so is it the fabric that's causing me issues, or is it how my machine is doing the buttonhole? So then I'll go back to a stable fabric, have the correct amount of support under it. And I feel like in my mind, I'm going back to square one, the most basic. Can I get a good buttonhole on this? And if I can, then that tells me then perhaps it's the fabric. So it gives me a way of analyzing what is causing the issue. I think also with the technique snafus, I know for me, my own frustration gets triggered pretty quickly, because like many people, I don't like feeling like I'm an idiot. And there are times using an attachment on a machine, it's like, I just can't get it to work. And then I feel like, oh my God, you're just, lots of people do this. How come I can't do it? I've read about all these people, they don't have any trouble. And here I'm having trouble. What's wrong with me? And so sometimes I've experienced that on one sewing machine, a type of attachment might work well, and on a different sewing machine, it might not work so well, the same type of attachment. So I think it's helpful to step back and say, well, what is going on here? What's causing the issue, and that's sparking the frustration? And some of that is recognizing when you are getting frustrated. And for me, talking to a lot of my students, there's often a somatic sign. So for me, my stomach starts to clench in knots, and I also start to clench my jaws. And so if I all of a sudden think, oh, my stomach doesn't feel great, and I realize I have this tension in my stomach, I've learned to honor that and say, okay, what else is going on? Are you starting to get frustrated? Or are you feeling pressure for a time pressure, or what's happening here? So it's a signal to me now, that recognition, my stomach is clenched up in knots. I should figure out where the frustration is coming from, if it is frustration, and then where is it coming from, so that I nip it in the bud quickly. For me, very often just taking literally a few deep breaths, and just stepping back from it for a minute will help. Sometimes I walk outside. Sometimes I go up to the kitchen and get a cup of tea. Sometimes I just need a little bit of a break and then come back to it and start in again with a better attitude. And sometimes that break is a lot longer than a few minutes.
Well, let me ask you, what do you do? I think sometimes people might have a beautiful piece of fabric that they want to start with, and so they are nervous from the very beginning, and they are uptight, like, I got to get this right the first time. I only have a certain amount of fabric, and I'm going to cut it out, and I'm going to sew it, but I'm not sure. I haven't used this fabric before. So how do you start if you're nervous? What do you do to get over the initial nervousness?
That's a really good question, because when I was doing a lot of custom clothing work, I'd have people bring me, oh, my aunt brought me this back from Thailand, and it's irreplaceable fabric, and here I was going to be the one working on it. So muslins are my best friend. They're my laboratory. So I will work on the fit in fitting muslins, revise that pattern, remake a muslin however many times it is, until that last muslin is like, oh, there are no changes. And so I usually get to the point where I think, okay, this is Murphy's Law. If I make another muslin, there probably not going to be any changes. So do I really need to make it? The answer is always yes, because if I make it and I don't need any changes, then I know my pattern has been proofed out. Everything is good to go. So that alleviates the potential frustration of the fit not being right. So usually I'll work in real muslin type fabric for my first muslins, unless it's a knit fabric, and then I'll use a knit for my muslin. And if it's a drapey fabric that I'm going to be using, then my last couple of muslins, I'll go into a drapey, inexpensive drapey fabric. But I will start with the firm, the crisp, regular muslin fabric. And that allows me to really proof my fit out nicely. So if my pattern is a mess, I will recopy it very accurately, retrue the seams, so that it has eliminated the issue that my pattern might be kind of crumply from so much tape and altering it, which is probably the case. So then I will make sure that I have a clean work surface, and then I will make sure that my pins and my cutting implement are in good shape. And if I'm if it's a print or a stripe, I have to pay attention to my layout. I very often will make a complete pattern. So I have a right and a left side of the pattern so I can lay it out single layer so I can actually see what's going on. Sometimes I sketch it out. So I take all of these little steps that I can so that I have proven to myself that it's going to work out. The key to the part to me, though, is really making sure that the fit is good. When I know that that last muslin was really perfect, usually cutting into the fabric, taking into account some of those other things I mentioned, it's at that point, it's a pure joy. At that point, we finally just get to sew. If it's a slippery fabric and the fabric is going to give you issues, or say a silk and rayon velvet, it's going to crawl, then I will step back and think, what can I do to make sure that I don't have trouble? And that's hand basting for me most of the time. So sometimes I'll hand baste the entire garment, main garment sections together and try it on. But you just take things as slow and easy as you need to.
If I'm using some kind of a knit that has a different amount of stretch on both grains, I usually take any little offcut that has sort of a triangular shape, and I practice the seams on both grains before I get into sewing on the real thing, so that I know that I've got the right needle, the right stitch, and that it's not going to pucker or skip stitches or something. So there's always that practice. It's that little, test each thing before you get into the real material.
That's what I refer to as test samples. And I talk about test samples all of the time. And after I've cut my garment out, you've got scraps, and I always will test needle, thread, tension, whatever I need to figure out. And sometimes it's at that point that I make interfacing decisions, because I need some scraps to do some test fusing or test application of interfacing.
The 2023 Threads Digital Ambassadors Challenge is in the works, and this year it's all about joyful dressing. Our 4 sewing experts are creating looks that spark happiness. They'll share those creations starting May 24th, and that's when you get to vote for your favorite. Your vote enters you for a chance to win a prize package valued at over $500. That package is provided by the sponsors Fit for Art Patterns, the International Bra Sewing Bee, ClothingLabelsForYou.com, and Threads. See the sweepstakes rules and restrictions for the Joyful Dressing Challenge on threadsmagazine.com. Cast your vote anytime between May 24th and 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, June 22nd, for a chance to win the prize package and to experience the joy.
The next thing you had on your list is ripping out as frustration. I think that almost is self-explanatory, but maybe you can give us some more details.
So there are a few things that I can talk about that I've done that help me a lot. If I have to rip out a part of a seam once, say I have an intersection of 2 seams that I need to get that perfectly matched, like a waist seam and a center back seam. If I have to rip out once, it's like, okay, I have to rip out. That's all right. And I will do it again. If it doesn't work the second time, then that tells me that I need to probably hand baste or do something so that I don't have to continue to rip out. 3 times to me is too much, because I might start to stress my fabric. So one thing that I've found, because there are times that I've made a lot of the garment and realize I need to take out a whole bunch of stitching, or I need to take out understitching around a facing, and I need to take the facing out. It's like, I don't want to have to sit here and do this. So for me, what I will do is put on some nice music or a book on tape or something, whatever it is that makes me feel calm. And I will almost always try to do the ripping out before I leave the particular session that I'm sewing, that episode of sewing. Because if I am going to go, if in my head and in reality, I know if I'm going to have set aside time to sew, and I know I'm going into it having to rip out, I will think up all kinds of different things to do, so I don't go down there and do it. Even though I want to be working on it, it just is like, oh, I don't want to have to do that. Whereas if I've made a mistake and I can rip it out right there, then leave, and that's important for me. I rip it out and then I take a break or maybe come back to it a day or two later. Then in my mind, I'm just going forward. I'm not having to do that back stepping at the beginning of my sewing time.
Well, that makes really great sense because toward the end of the session anyway, people are not always making their best decisions or doing their best work. And so when you just do that when it doesn't matter, because ripping out doesn't take quite the same, I mean, you have to be careful, but it doesn't take the same level of focus maybe as actually putting something together. And then when you come back to start, you're fresh and you have all the pieces ready to sew.
Yes. And there are times I don't know whether I really need to rip something out. And often I will leave my sewing area and do something for the rest of the day and come back to it the next day, or maybe come back to it later that day and reassess it with fresh eyes and say, okay, do I need to pull it out? And if I do, okay, it's X amount of time to pull it out. And that's something that I think is really helpful to recognize about our sewing frustration is things that we don't like to do loom large in our brains. And there have actually been studies done on this. And so in actuality, for me to rip out 10 inches of a seam, how long is it really going to take if it's a cotton fabric? Not really that long, but it's the act that I'm having to rip out that makes it loom large. So an example I will give of a daily task. I used to dread having to, oh my God, I have to unload the dishwasher. I do it every single morning, but I don't want to have to unload the dishwasher. So one day I timed myself, and usually I can get a dishwasher unloaded in 6 minutes. So then it's like, okay, I need to unload the dishwasher. It no longer looms large. It's like, okay, 6-7 minutes, I can have my cup of tea made by then and be ready to roll. So that's something else to think about is doing some time studies for yourself and actually write it down and think about what frustrates you, maybe in ripping out, or some test samples. Give yourself some timed tests and see how long it actually takes to do some of these things. You might be surprised that it really doesn't take all that long, but it gets this sort of onerous aspect to it because it's something that we don't want to have to do.
Yeah. And, I think sometimes people do get frustrated. Some people, it takes longer to do things than others, but I don't think they should punish themselves for that. Everybody processes things and does things differently. And, I have someone in my family who takes a long time to do things sometimes, and she gets very frustrated with that. It's like, well, that's okay. That's just your way. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with taking longer to do something. Anything.
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the things I have always loved about sewing is that there are times I want to make a garment in a hurry, and it's like, okay, this is not quick and dirty, but it's a quick project, and that's how it appears in my hand. But one of the things I love about sewing is the contemplative situation that I'm setting up for myself. I love to underline something. I put on some nice music, I get everything set up, and then, maybe it'll take me 2 or 3 hours to underline part of a garment. But just the pleasure of the needle and thread going through the fabric and the rhythm of it, knowing what I'm going to be accomplishing by doing that. So I do think it takes some of us longer to do things than others, but we have our culture as a whole, I think, has a premium on quickness and speed. And I think we can take a step back from that and say, maybe we should just enjoy how this creative process is going along, how the fabric feels in our hands and how the needle and thread feel.
Well, I think this jumps us all the way to your last point about productivity, because especially with social media and people posting, 3 new garments a week. And first of all, I don't know who needs that many clothes. And secondly, if it sets up this example that that's what a fun home sewer is supposed to do, then it's going to be hard to meet that standard if you have any kind of a life other than just sewing 3 garments a week. It's just not going to happen. And I would hate for people to just get frustrated about sewing in general because they're not cranking out so many pieces. And when in fact, yeah, you can enjoy the process of it. You can, not to, the eye on the prize thing, it doesn't have to be exactly that, but you were talking about applying and underlining, hand basting it on when you know the purpose of each step that you're taking and that it's worthwhile putting the time in to do it well, because you will be paid back by a garment that you're going to really like. It's going to function well for you and you're going to have it for years. That's something to remember. And then maybe you don't get upset about like, oh, I'm not going to get 3 of these done. I'm only going to get 1 and it's going to take me 2 weeks. But then it'll be beloved and it will last you a long time.
Yes. There's another aspect to productivity, though, that I've seen in a lot of my students. And some people, and I know I'm good at this in other aspects of my life, are really good at undermining themselves. So for me, if I haven't been sewing very much, it's really hard to get myself down into my sewing space and get started sewing. It doesn't make any sense. I love sewing. I've sewn since I was a preteen. I know I love sewing. I know I always feel good after I've been sewing. But if I haven't been sewing for a while, there is something that is like that hump to get over, to get myself into it. So part of being, a lot of people get frustrated with themselves because they can't get themselves sewing. And there are a number of things that I have talked with students and helped students with regarding this. One is finding a couple of gateways into sewing. My biggest gateway is to do a little bit of ironing. I have some linen garments. I iron my pillowcases because I love getting into a bed with iron pillowcases. I have some linen garments. Maybe at the end of this last year's season, like now, they need to be ironed, ready for this coming warmer weather. And for me, I'll turn the iron on and just start ironing the garment. And it's pleasurable to me. I know it's not to everybody, but this is what works for me. And the point is to find what works for you. And after I've ironed 2 or 3 garments, I'm there next to my sewing machine. And it's like, I cannot wait to start to sew something. So for some people, it's cleaning up their sewing space or organizing that pile of fabric, or pulling a few fabrics or a lot of fabrics out from their collection and reorganizing it and getting inspired by seeing some combinations that they've never seen before. It might be that you literally are cleaning up around your sewing machine area. But pay attention. I refer to this as looking over your own shoulder. As you're going through your sewing practice, look over your own shoulder. What are some of those things that make you think, oh yeah, now I want to go sew? Maybe it's to listen to a Threads podcast. Maybe it's to look at 1 or 2 of your favorite social media people. And whatever that is, make a note of it. I really am a huge person on actually writing things down. And then if you're in that kind of funk that I described, I get into where it's like, I want to go sew, but it's like, oh, I don't want to have to go down there and do it. It's ridiculous, but I can't get myself sewing. Then I can say to myself, okay, then go iron something and see if that helps.
That is a great idea. I think some people stop themselves when they think, oh, I need a good chunk of time to do this. I need a 3-hour window where I can actually sit down and get going. And do you have to wait until you have a big chunk of time?
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I much prefer to sew if I have at least an hour and a half or 2 hours. If I have 4 hours in a day, then that's sort of luxurious to me. But there have been many spells of my life where I have made entire garments in a week by doing half-hour sewing sessions. If it's not a super complicated garment and I can manage to squeeze in 2 seams or 1 long seam, then if I do that in my lunch break, right before I start my checking emails for the day, whatever it is where you can squeeze it in, then you can start to make some progress. I do think it's helpful to understand if you are a short burst or a long session sewer by nature, and respect that nature as much as you can, but understand that our lives are all busy and there are going to be times that we can't sew in our ideal world. I literally had to teach myself to be a 1 or 2 seam sewer. That it wasn't satisfying at the time, but at the end of the week when I had a new skirt, it sure was satisfying.
I'm kind of like that too. And I think, well, I have a place that I can sew that's pretty much set up all the time. I know you have a studio, but not everybody listening has a dedicated sewing space. So you were going to talk about sewing spaces, and I was thinking about somebody who has to take their sewing machine out every time and then put it away when they're done.
Right.
That was my life for a while, and I did find it really frustrating. I had such a drive to sew, and then every time you'd have to go through that process of setting up and knocking it down at the end. Really, it just made it a little bit harder.
Yeah, I could take the wind out of your sails if that's the situation. I know some people are in a situation that there is no alternative. They're going to have to set up and take down. But even if you can find a very small space, a corner of your living room, or even I've talked to people who have a little sewing table in their dining room, and just some place where you can leave a small table with your machine on it, and then invest in some sort of storage system. And that sounds like it's a big thing. It could just be from an inexpensive store where it's a bin on wheels with some 3 drawers that pull out and push in, so that you can have the tools that you use most of the time right in there, and say that has to get wheeled into a closet, but you can wheel it out relatively easily, and it has those basic tools. Of course, it's not going to have everything you like to use, but it's going to have your basic tools in it: your scissors, rotary cutters, thread snips, your bobbins and threads. I think there are other things that you can do to help with your sewing space, and one of them, again, is looking over your own shoulder and think about what the mechanics are of how you like to sew, literally the body mechanics. I like my machine, if I'm sitting at my machine here, I like my ironing board to the left. I like to stand up when I iron. I don't like to sit down when I iron, but I like my ironing board at a particular height. So as Carol said, I'm fortunate I have a studio, so I have this dedicated space. But think about that type of mechanics. I was in one situation where I had to walk into a different room to use an ironing board, and I thought that I was going to go nuts. I was in somebody else's home, and I finally said, would you mind if I pulled that ironing board in next to my sewing machine for a couple of hours? So think about your sewing space in terms of efficiency, and particularly if you realize that you're getting frustrated by doing something, then that's a really big signal to you, or at least to me, that's when I would say you need to think about, well, what can I do so that I'm averting that frustration? I will tell you that for me, we all have these sort of quirks. I don't like putting spools of thread and bobbins away. So I pull them off the machine, I set them down, I want to get going on the next thing, so they're just sitting there. And then it just irks me to see these threads and bobbins around, and I'm always knocking them on the floor. And you know what a bobbin does. It goes all the way under the next table, and you have to get on your hands and knees. So to avert all of that frustration, I have trained myself, sort of like this dishwasher thing, but I've trained myself when I take a spool of thread off, I wind it around and I put it in the drawer where it's supposed to go, or the bin. And the bobbins, the same thing. I try not to let myself do what is my natural want to do, which is set them aside, because in the long run, it frustrates me when they're falling off the table. But how many years have I been sewing? And it was about 5 years ago that I realized that this was a source of frustration for me. I mean, come on. But I think we all get so used to working the way we work that we forget to look over our own shoulders. But if you can, I'm going to go back to that somatic feeling. If you can figure out what part of your body, some people will start clearing their throats or start to scratch or something. So if that's the key to you, the signal to you that you're getting frustrated, then pay attention to that and say, okay, what is it that's frustrating me? Is it the actual sewing? Is it that my area is a mess, or the bobbins are rolling off the table? And try to talk yourself into, well, what can I do to avert that? And for me, talking myself into, well, just give yourself a little rule here. When you take a spool of thread off, put it away. How hard can that be?
Well, we're coming to the end, Sarah, and we haven't covered everything. But one thing I wanted to mention was something that I heard you talk about on one of your YouTube videos, and that was when you have a garment that doesn't go well, and how you critique it. And I was thinking about this as part of sort of a self-talk thing to get into that sort of jargon. But the idea of praise yourself. I put these bobbins and threads away, and now I'm going to be happier because when I work, they're not going to bother me. But you have some other ways of talking to yourself when you're looking at a project that didn't go as planned.
Yeah. I think it's extremely important when you finish a garment to take a few minutes to put it on your dress form, hang it up on a hanger in front of you, put it on and look at it yourself in the mirror, and appreciate the fact that you made that. You created it. You took a 2-dimensional piece of fabric and you created a 3-dimensional garment. So just the creative act itself, give yourself a pat on the back for engaging in the creativity. Then find 1 or 2 or 3 things that you are very pleased with about the project. Even if the project is a disaster, find something about it that you like. And that might be, I like the color of the fabric, or I found a really good thread match, or I found really nice buttons for it. Whatever you can find, even if you feel like you have to dig kind of deep to find, to come up, but try to find some things that went well. Maybe you made some intersecting seams that matched really nicely, or maybe 2 out of 5 seams matched nicely. Give yourself the credit for that. Let yourself appreciate that you did some things well. And then allow yourself to think about what didn't go well, and make some notes and think about why they didn't go well. Because if you can start to understand why they didn't go well, and not just have a ball of frustration in your stomach that they didn't go well, but if you can understand why they didn't, then you'll be able to meet with success more and more often. So maybe for me, one of the things that's happened recurrently throughout my sewing career is I have not made the right choice of interfacing product. Either I over-interfaced, meaning it was too structured for the garment I wanted or the particular fabric I was using, or it was not enough interfacing. Very often, that doesn't mean that garment goes in the trash can. It means that I will still wear it. I just know that it's not as good as it could have been. So in that case, what do? If I have some scrap fabric left, I would recommend that then what I try to do then and would recommend to you is that then you use some different interfacing products on that and keep that with that with a pattern for that project. So you say, I had this fabric, I used this interfacing, it was too much or it was too little structure. And I then tested this, and maybe I should have used that. For me, I keep my patterns in a large manila envelope. All of that goes right into the envelope so that the next time I pull the pattern out, I have it there. With my knit garments, my regular t-shirt pattern, I adjust knits on the center front and center back fold as to according to how stretchy the fabric is. And I keep a swatch. I keep a record of where I cut on the fold, and I keep a swatch of that fabric. And I then make notes afterwards. Did that fit nicely, or do I wish I had cut it differently? Basically, you're making a reference library for yourself.
This is such good advice. I think it's really easy, and I know I tend to do this. For example, I will look at say a shirt that I made and say, oh, I managed to get that sleeve in with no puckers, but look at what a cruddy job I did on that one. Instead of saying, oh, look at how great that one is. I made a really good one, and I wonder what went wrong here. How do I fix it for the next time around? I'm willing to focus on the negative instead of the positive in what I've done. And that can just... It just magnifies your frustration instead of finding a way to solve it and get past it.
Yes, it's exactly right. And what you want to do is always not minimize your frustration. I think it's important to recognize that you are frustrated, but to understand that source of the frustration so that then you can maybe you're going to take another class or get some professional help with your fitting, or take a class on fabric so that you learn more about fabrics. Whatever the issue is, then once you know what it is, then you can educate yourself and self-educate or have help from others so that you aren't going to be making that same mistake over and over again.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This was great to hear all about your experiences with your own frustration and with other people's. I mean, I always look at your work as an author and as somebody who sews and designs, and don't imagine that you'd ever make mistakes or be frustrated, but I know it happens to everyone.
I very often say that one of the reasons, the real reason I like to teach is to help people avoid the many, many hundreds and thousands of mistakes that I've made.
Some people have to learn on their own. Yeah. Well, thanks so much. And I hope we talk to you again. Maybe not about frustrations. We'll talk about victories, sewing victories.
That would be great.
In the
Thanks
future.
very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you to our guest for joining us, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send your comments, questions, and suggestions to th@taunton.com. And please like, comment, and subscribe wherever you're listening. It helps others find our podcast. Until next time, keep on sewing with threads.